Very good evening, everyone. Welcome to GW Prime Live. Your where is here. We all have heard the word crisis and its escalation, and how the various upheavals and chaos have become an integral part of our lives, our political systems, and our world processes, especially after COVID. And when we see increasing global warming and increasing interconnection of various risks. So, as the German sociologist Ulrich Beck said, risk society, it won't be unfair to say that we live at a time of intensifying risks. To discuss the intersection of various risks as well as the world of crisis and how to navigate it ahead and the various convergences that are coming together, we have a very special and distinguished guest today, Professor Michael Spence. Professor Michael Spence won the 2001 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics along with Joseph Stiglitz and Michael Akerlof for his work on asymmetric market information and signaling. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, Professor Spence, I was reading your very interesting and enlightening book on Perma-Crisis. So, I must admit, I read that word for the very first time, and then I got to know that it was the Collins Dictionary word of 2022, the year
Correct.
where we had just started recovering from the pandemic. And
Right.
you have laid down a very practical pathway, a very good guideline on how to navigate this perma crisis. So, Professor Spence, what are the key trends in this perma crisis that you see at the economic level, at the social level, at the institutional level?
Well, when we wrote the book, I had two co-authors, that were Mohammed Alari and Gordon Brown. And so we put our heads together as the pandemic was proceeding, in the hope of trying to bring some clarity and focus into a world that looked like it was changing pretty rapidly and subject to shock. So the way I think about it, very briefly, is what we're experiencing now is the collision of three powerful sets of forces. One is, increasingly frequent and quite severe shocks coming from multiple sources: pandemics, wars. Climate shocks are now pretty much global and a macroeconomically significant event. And others. So we have the occasional financial crisis. We have a rising sovereign debt in the global economy that makes it more vulnerable, and so on. So that's one set. The second is a set of secular trends. They're not the same everywhere in the world. So in India, you have a young economy. In China, you have an aging economy. In the developed world, you have an aging economy. In the developed world, you have very dramatically declining productivity trends, and so on. So these things are sort of colliding. But then the third set are these amazing scientific and technological transformations that are sort of, colliding into the picture that I just painted. A multi-decade digital one with a striking acceleration with the appearance of generative AI. An equally powerful, in some ways, biomedical and life sciences revolution, and a massive, massive energy transition that is needed to be undertaken on a global basis in order to achieve a sustainability. So the question is, can we make sense of all this? And I think the first thing to note is that the combination of these things is producing extraordinarily large amount of structural change in the global economy. Everywhere you look, global supply chains are diversifying in a way they're not built anymore on efficiency and comparative advantage considerations. We're probably going to experience a huge productivity surge, which will help a lot with some of the growth challenges that we see. We have inflation for the first time in the West in 3 to 4 decades. And a different interest rate environment that has implications. And generally, we seem in much of the world to have switched to a supply constraint from a demand constraint pattern of growth. So this book is an attempt to suggest that this is not an easy, situation to navigate. It's different. It requires different models and mindsets than we used for the past 30 or 40 years. And if we stick with the old ones, we'll make, a sequence of mistakes and make things worse. And then, we are in the last thing I guess I want to emphasize, I'll do this on behalf of Gordon, but all three of us, is that a world which is fragmenting fairly rapidly in terms of the way it's put together globally, economically and technologically, is not a world that is particularly beneficial. It's a world where it's much more difficult to solve the climate change problem. It's a world where countries can be left out, and so on. So what we really want to do is not find a solution to this, because nobody knows what it is, but to find steps that will take us in a more beneficial direction.
That's exactly what has been recommended, and I particularly liked how you phrased it as there is nothing permanent about a perma-crisis. Right. Even though there are connotations that it is enduring, but there is nothing permanent about it, and there is always light ahead at the end of the tunnel, provided we all work collectively towards it and we all put our hands on the deck. So, Professor Spence, from this, my next question would be, you before this you wrote about the next convergence, the convergence of economies, and especially you mentioned since 1750s, since 1850s, after the first industrial revolution, then after the Second World War, a lot of countries, especially the Asian tigers, they entered the manufacturing club, then they entered the high middle income group and the high income group. So an increasing convergence between the developing world and the developed world took place, to an extent that the labels of developing were no longer used, and now we prefer emerging economies instead. So right. Where do you think this trend is heading next? Like, if you would like to revisit the next convergence now in 2024, what would be your advice?
So if I were writing that book now, I think I still would believe that the convergence process is going to continue. It's a multi-decade process, probably takes a century to complete. I think, the evidence supports that. If you go back 15, 20 years, the vast majority of people lived in countries that were classified as either low income or low middle income, and that's no longer true. There's just been a massive shift as a result of the growth of the emerging economies. And it isn't just Asia anymore. I mean, India is on a roll, with 7.3% growth last year. Looks sustainable. It's going to produce another round of massive change in the global economy. The ASEAN countries are growing. Some of the Latin American countries are growing. And even some of the African countries are starting to show signs of growth. If I were going to worry about the convergence process right now, I would worry about the low-income countries, because growth, especially in the early stages, is hard to engineer. And the past episodes of this, you mentioned China, India, etc., occurred, at least the early stages, in a much more benign global environment, less subject to shocks. The pandemic, for example, used up a lot of fiscal capacity to try to buffer both the health shock and the economic shock, as we had to shut down economies. That's a devastating blow to the low-income countries, because they have relatively little fiscal capacity left in order to carry out the public sector side of successful growth strategies, the investment side. And so I think convergence is underway. It may be a little slower than we anticipated because of a more complex, more fragmented world where nationalism is starting to appear. Unilateral actions that marginalize multilateral institutions are more common now. But these are strong economies, right? With the exception of some of the low-income economies. And for them, I think this is starting to look like a perfect storm. And they need and deserve some help from the rest of us in order not to get left behind.
Is it the calm before the storm that we are?
Well, hopefully it's not the calm before the storm, because what we're hoping is we won't have a full-blown storm. So, I mean, the storm has many parts. So we could transition to a world in which there's basically two big spheres of influence, led by China and the United States. I don't think it's very likely, because India won't join either one of those, and a whole lot of other emerging economies won't join up to that kind of architecture either. So, but it could get worse from where it is. But our hope is that, well-intentioned people in a variety of, positions, civil society organizations, policy-making positions, business and finance, will recognize that this is a perilous moment, and try to join the forces that are trying to steer this in a more beneficial direction. And we do think that's possible. I mean, let me be clear. Wishful thinking, along the lines that we can go back to the world we lived in the 1990s and early 2000s, that's not going to happen. It's a multipolar world. There are multiple centers of power. They have different interests, different governance structures, different value systems. National security considerations are real, and we can't simply ignore them. And so the challenge here is not, to kind of go back from where we came, but to construct an architecture that's broadly beneficial across the entire global economy, that's a realistic architecture, recognizing the new features of the world that we have to deal with now, including especially climate change.
Climate change is acknowledged as one of the most dreaded existential threats that we collectively face. And for that, the entire world needs to come together. Professor Spence, as you mentioned about economic convergence, simultaneously, we are also witnessing technological convergence, a convergence of different technologies, different processes, and from mainstream IT to geospatial to space to big data to artificial intelligence and IoT and generative AI coming together. So do you think technology would have an effect on socio-economic behavior as it traditionally had, like during the first industrial revolution or before that? So would there be a very disruptive impact of these technologies on societies and polities?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is a very good question. I think the answer to that is yes. So just a couple of thoughts on that score. So, these big, powerful technologies, I mean, the best known one's electricity. It transformed the world. Take a long time to produce the beneficial effects. And on that journey, it's disruptive. And I think the transitions that we're going to underway, and by the way, you're absolutely right. These things are converging. I mean, in multiple dimensions, artificial intelligence in various forms is expected to be an important part of the energy transition and sustainability. It's certainly going to be, an accelerator in the breakthroughs in biomedical and life sciences. And those are just examples. I mean, we see this everywhere. And so the question is, is it disruptive? Yes. Do we need to try to find a way to buffer the shock for people who are disrupted, say in conventional energy areas? I think the answer to that's yes. Can we do it perfectly? Probably not. At least there are no examples of having done it perfectly. But the other thing I think to keep in mind is that big, powerful technologies have enormous upside potential and also downside risks. And my favorite example of this is gene editing. So that's a relatively new technology that we've had for the last 10 or 15 years. It's getting more powerful, but the scientists who know how to use it, and the medical professionals realize that they have to develop a set of norms. There are ways to use that are just frankly dangerous. And the same is true in the digital technologies and AI, and we're in mid-process in thinking that through. I mean, the policy attempts to address the challenges associated with generative AI has just gotten underway in the last 2 years, and there are very hard problems. I mean, we have to address, for example, this question of sort of intellectual property and copyright. Human beings produced a lot of things, music, plays, poetry, and so on. And large language models hoover that up pretty quickly. So the question is, can we deal with that? And that's a hard problem that we had a strike in Hollywood, maybe in Bollywood, we'll have the same kind of thing, that the purpose of which is to try to hammer out a set of norms and rules and regulations that affect the way Gen AI is applied and used. So it is disruptive. There's no question about that. And I think it would be naive just to focus on the long-term benefits. But I do believe that if we stumble, I guess is the way I would through, and find a way to make the upside potential in terms of productivity, in terms of expanded healthcare, expanded, scientific research, expanded education, it's very hard to find a place if you focus on, AI, that doesn't have a beneficial sort of, application somewhere in the global economy and society. So maybe I'm just too optimistic, but I think we'll find a way to make sure this upside potential is realized. And from an economic point of view, it's really important. I mean, we have aging populations, low fertility rates in the developed world. And in some Asian countries, we have, declining productivity, we've high debt levels, inflation, higher interest rates. I mean, this is a pretty ugly scene, declining global growth. It seems to me there's two ways to deal with that. One is to expand the opportunities for the people who are not yet really connected to the global economy. That's the thing we talked about before. And the third is to use these powerful tools that we've been given by the scientific and technological community to solve these problems: productivity, climate change, etc. And I think a lot of people are trying to do that. So, to me, it's not the calm before the storm. I'm hoping it's the calm before, a turning point and an acceleration in a much more beneficial direction.
Professor Spence, you wrote a very interesting thing about SDGs, that when we talk about sustainable development goals, we focus on sustainability aspect, on the emissions aspect, but the security part is often missing, be it food security, energy security, or security of resources, or general security. So what do you think needs to be done to embed this security thinking at the heart of sustainability and to make a security parameter also a part of the SDG roadmap?
That's another very good question. So, I mean, one indicator that, we need some adjustment is that, if you look around the world at places, where you try to get insurance, and they're subject to increasing climate shocks, it's clear the private sector, is withdrawing from these sectors because they can't handle the risk. They're correlated risks, and they can't deal with it. So I think we're in the process of, integrating resilience at the business level, and sort of security at the policy level into our thinking. Now the question, so it basically because people are aware in various categories, business people, policymakers, ordinary citizens are aware that we're vulnerable in a world that is has supply chains that are strung too tightly, where we're connected to people or countries that we feel we can't rely on, and that's a symmetric relationship. If you take the United States and China, there's very little trust at this point between them. So that means that the Chinese feel vulnerable and are being subjected to restrictions, a growing set of restrictions, and Americans feel vulnerable because they think, we can get cut off from access to various things like, most advanced semiconductors and so on. So it's not as if you have to convince people, that we need to think about these things, because it's already happening. It's happening in business. It's happening in the architecture of supply chains, happening in policy with friendshoring, nearshoring, homeshoring, and a whole lot of other things. The challenge is to do sensible things that increase security for countries and for people, but not do them in such a way that you pay a cost that's just way higher than we need to pay. And I think that's where we are. So you can find in any country people who say, well, we don't like this kind of interdependence. We can get rid of that. Well, it's just not very realistic. The price of achieving true independence, for any country, even big ones like India, China, the United States, Europe taken together, are just way too high. And so the question is, so what are restrictions that really do, or policies that move economic activity around? What are those policies that give you a fairly large benefit at a relatively low cost? And that's, I think, what we're searching for in a highly decentralized way. So, I mean, hopefully one of the outcomes of this will be a revitalization and increased capitalization of some multilateral entities that, have important roles to play in coordinating economic, activity, coordinating interdependence in a way. I think it's an open question whether we're going to go in that direction or go in another direction. But I don't have any doubt that, the world we're living in is one where sort of security in various dimensions is an increasingly powerful determinant of decision making, including policy decision making.
Professor Spence, the tug of war, or we can say the tango, between politics on one hand and economics on the other hand, has been going on since the French Revolution, or even before, we can say.
Right.
So around 1940s, the Hungarian economist and public intellectual Karl Polanyi wrote a book, The Great Transformation, which is still regarded as sort of one of the most influential reads still. So do you think with artificial intelligence and with all of this hyper-speed world and with this multilateral convergence happening at exponential pace, would we enter a new consensus between politics and economics, or a great transformation 2.0?
I'm not sure I know, have a view on that. I mean, I do have a view. I think the transformation is going to be, how do I put it? Once people start to understand the potential of a technology like this, they start to make a mistake. And the mistake is to think that it'll all happen, sort of tomorrow, meaning in the very near future. That is not a good description of what's happened in the past with similar, transformational things. They take decades. You need to change people's attitudes, behavior, training, education, business models, mindsets, all kinds of things have to change to take full advantage of these changes. So, but having said all that, I do think that the current collection of technologies of which Gen AI and it is probably a leading example, is transformational. But part of the problem, in sort of getting there, and this relates to politics, is that these things, when they happen at very high speed, are actually quite frightening. So if you take Gen AI and go out in the street and ask, almost anybody, you'll run into what I call the automation bias, right? They'll think, because of the way this is talked about in the media and the press and in other fora, they'll think they're coming for my job. That's the only thing this is about. Not that they're going to give me powerful tools to make me more productive, hopefully reflected in my income and my opportunities, which is the hoped for outcome, but they're coming for my job. And so very rapid change is frightening and meets resistance. And that resistance is expressed in the political process. And that's not a problem. I mean, the purpose of most political systems is to modulate what's going on in the world, and economically and technologically, in such a way that it, turns out to be beneficial. At least this is what, well-intentioned governments are supposed to do. And so I think we're seeing a kind of natural, tug of war, I guess I would call it, between, the technology part, and parts of the economy that want to run as fast as possible, and the political and social side that want to sort of say, no, wait, let's take a minute here and see if we can develop some greater clarity about, the destination that we're heading for, and this is healthy. I don't worry about that. I'm not one of the. There are people who think, the best thing you can do for the technology transformation process is simply get out of the way. I'm not in that camp. I think there's an educational process here, and not all resistance is well informed. But that doesn't mean you want to marginalize the resistance and allow the political system to take an important role. And indeed, it looks like it is. Now, if you pressed me, and I wrote a paper with James Monique at Google as a friend in Foreign Affairs. And so, and we said that the upside potential economically is very high. It isn't automatic. It's got to be based on the diffusion of this and availability and accessibility to a very wide range of entities, including small and medium-sized businesses. There's a real risk of, divergence, tech, finance, big players, move ahead. Everybody else, other sectors get left behind. We've done that before, so it's not theoretical. There's a role for government on both the positive and the negative sides. I would say that on the negative side, there's ample activity, if not, there are differing, levels of advancement. Europe has moved faster than the United States, but everybody's moving to try to constrain the downside risks and misuse of the technologies. I think for James and me, we would say the upside potential, the policy side of the upside potential is underdeveloped at this point, that we really do need to worry, and try to devise means of making sure that this is as widely accessible as possible.
You've written about Nash equilibrium, that Nash equilibrium often is the only way for competing and even antagonistic parties to basically come together to share information, to cooperate. So do you think we need a Nash equilibrium sort of a situation to advance sustainability?
Well, we do, because a Nash equilibrium, one version of a Nash equilibrium is one where, entities with appropriate incentives, pursue, whatever it is, profits, rate of return on capital, investors, etc. But so the policy challenge is to engineer the environment, the incentives, if you like, so that the Nash equilibrium, meaning Nash equilibrium for your audience is a non-cooperative equilibrium. That's where everybody produces their interests as they're seen. So the challenge is to create incentive structure so the Nash equilibrium gets us where we want to go over time, right? So that means, putting prices on carbon. It means, subsidizing certain kinds of technology development. It means making sure it flows around the world, as frictionlessly as possible. All of those things are things that both policy and multilateral cooperation need to do as part of the engineering of the. So we're not to create the structure where we're moving in the right direction when entities pursue their interests. I mean, there's lots of pieces of that. It's very complicated. We need, space may be part of the answer to creating really good measurement systems that underpin things like carbon offset markets, because if you don't have good measurement systems, those markets are undercut by divergences between where you want to go and what actually happens. So you need to know whether there's actually a net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions associated with the carbon offset market, whether it's voluntary or mandatory in various parts of the world. And for that, you need measurement. So again, technology may help us out here. I've been very struck by the expanding array of things that get measured much more accurately as a result of the development of the technologies in space.
Professor Spence, coming from accurate and precise monitoring, modeling, visualization, and data presentation, I'll come to which is perhaps one of the oldest riddles in resource conservation, that what belongs to everybody belongs to nobody, the tragedy of the commons. But
Right.
Elinor Ostrom has shown us the way the tragedy of the commons can be turned into governance of the commons as well. So, do you think technology awareness and technology accessibility and the reach to the grassroots level will create this consciousness, this awareness about co-ownership, maybe about governing common resources, and technology and public policy and economics and social behavior can all join forces here?
Well, it will help, and I think we've moved in that direction. I mean, so this problem, as you just pointed out, is not new. It goes back to, pre-industrial Britain, where, too many sheep were eating the grass on the common because there was no system for restricting it, and we know that's a problem kind of all over the place. So, we know that the global fisheries industry tends to be overfished if there aren't sort of agreements and mechanisms for restricting the level of fishing, whaling, etc. I mean, there's many examples of this, and climate change is an example of that. The hard part, or one of the hard parts in the climate change area, is that once you restrict the access to a natural resource, a public good, something that everybody benefits from, then the question is, has to do with the details, like who gets, what fraction of the access. And this is a big problem in climate change because the majority of the greenhouse gases that currently are parked in the atmosphere are due to the past development, growth and economic, functioning of the developed economies on the one hand, and the increments are coming mainly now from the larger developing, emerging economies. And so there's a question of fairness, and it's not an easy question to solve. And virtually every single meeting of the Conference of the Parties, the COP meetings, annual COP meetings, in one way or another, has to deal with this distributional issue. So to put it bluntly, the question is, how much should each country, each industry, each person, contribute in terms of altering their activities in a way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And so solving the problem of the commons, of which this is a good example, maybe the biggest, most complicated example, involves making some distributional choices, and it's not easy to agree on what those should be.
That's very true. Professor Spence, as you have written about that technology advancements and being at the cutting edge of technology infusion often leads to capacity building. It leads to better educational opportunities, more industrialization, which eventually leads to specialization, domain specialization. But there is a peril associated with over specialization, which is the Dutch disease that you have warned against, and that is sort of a caution. So, do you think that countries in Asia or Africa, which are growing very fast, which are adopting technology very fast, do they risk getting into the Dutch disease trap, and how to avoid it? Like how to avoid monocultures, and how to avoid all of the resource and technology concentration towards a few sectors that ultimately hobble diversification?
It's an important problem. So the Dutch disease is usually associated, and I'm not saying it should be only associated, but usually associated with countries that have considerable natural resource wealth. Could be agriculture, could be fossil fuels, could be minerals. And there are a lot of those countries, including a lot of them in Africa, which tends to be natural resource very rich. And what happens in those places, unless there's a kind of active countermeasures are taken, is that the natural evolution of the economy tends to depend, especially the tradable part, the export and import sector. The export sector tends to be dominated by the natural resources, and the domestic development of a wider array, a diverse array of industries in the tradable sector, goods and services, tends to be truncated. And so you end up importing those things. It's hard to say, make a generalization about technology in this respect. I think it's not true, as I see it anyway, that technology necessarily creates this problem. It does create some challenges. So, for example, let's suppose that there's with putting Gen AI in robots is going to make robotics take another giant leap forward, including in unstructured environments. The upside potential of that is enormous. And so the question is the labor-intensive, process-oriented manufacturing and assembly model of early stage growth going to work, for the future or for long enough to serve the interests of all countries before they make a transition to a digitally capital-intensive set of technologies? And I think the jury's open on that, because once that transition occurs, the architecture of global supply chains, which has been built basically on going around and finding and accessing and using very valuable human resources, because human resources are the least mobile. When you compare it to goods, services delivered on the internet, capital, and technology, all of that flows pretty easily. But humans, don't just slosh around the economy. That architecture would be undercut, along with the growth models in developing countries. So I think there are open questions about whether technology is, one way of thinking about it is if that growth model doesn't work, but you still need the global economy to help you turbocharge growth, then, what's the alternative? And it sounds like it's going to have to be, in services, and it's a model that, we don't have a fully developed example of. And one wonders whether, that means you have to sort of, skip 2 steps on the ladder to get where you want to go. So, and what makes this complicated is this isn't going to happen overnight. So it's a transition. You have to guess, which growth model is kind of going to work. I think this is it's a good example of, there are, I guess, almost all technologies can be viewed as a double-edged sword, right? With one sharp side that gets you a long way in the direction you want to go, and another side that can kind of hurt you. But for the most part, I think the beneficial effects is there some reason why? Are there a range of countries in which, that can't benefit from this technology? I think the answer to that's no. I mean, small countries, they're going to be specialized anyway, right? I mean, even if they're developed countries, I mean, there will never be a time in which Sweden looks like the United States economy. It's just too small. And, ditto, a whole bunch of other countries. So the notion that somehow we can make a transition away from economic interdependence doesn't seem to me to be very realistic. So then we have to learn to live with interdependence and the risks and so on that exposes us to.
But that's where the big challenge is, how to mitigate these risks, or how to basically be forewarned enough in advance to act when these risks strike us. So, Professor Spence, one very interesting thing that you have mentioned is about the demand side of things and the supply side of things, especially when China, its economy was opening up in the early 80s, and how when Deng Xiaoping sought the advice of the World Bank on economic transition and on how to basically match demand and supply. So coming to demand and supply and the supply chains, today everyone talks about supply chain resilience about decoupling, about nearshoring. But what was very interesting that in 2010 or around, supply chain was regarded as, I'm quoting you, one of the 10 ways to exit a conversation. Like it was considered a very boring topic, a topic that interestingly, like instantly would say, like people would be like, oh, I want to go. This is the very boring, too boring. So, like, what has like this shift? What has precipitated this shift other than the pandemic? Like today, it has become a buzzword. It has become almost like a keyword that is everywhere in all discussions at all levels, and like from bottom to the top, everyone is interested in supply chains, in knowing about supply chains, their management, how to make them resilient. So was it pandemic that opened people's horizons and that basically increased this awareness?
Yeah, it was the pandemic, right? Because the screw ups were so large that, or the imbalances or whatever, the shortages. So what happened in the pandemic is that the supply chains were shocked by closures, by companies and whole sectors going into survival mode. So whatever buffers there were in the global supply chains, they got sort of squeezed out. Just because of that's what you had to do to survive. If you had a little more inventory, that's not a good idea if you're trying to stay alive. And port closings, all kinds of things. So yes, people became much more aware that that a kind of smoothly functioning supply chain is a pretty important element of economic continuity, and I think the pandemic contributed to that. But if you go back a decade, to the great financial crisis, which affected mostly directly the developed economies, after that, the balance sheet damage was sufficiently large in the household and business and financial sectors. And something similar happened in Europe on the sovereign debt side, that we lived because of that damage in a world, where the demand constraints were the operative thing. People were basically, they'd lost a lot of assets in houses and other things. They were rebuilding their balance sheets so they could retire. If you look at the sort of so-called baby boomer generation, the older crowd in the advanced countries, many of them didn't retire in the pattern that was expected because they couldn't afford it. So that they took a decade. That created a demand-constrained environment, basically. And in a demand-constrained environment, if you try to talk about, things like supply chains and efficiency and transparency or even productivity, it's not that interesting, right? Because it's not the binding constraint. And so the pandemic was a kind of turning point, right? So some of the sort of supply constraining factors like productivity declines and whatnot that really hadn't been, kind of the center of attention suddenly became the center of attention, when we came out of the pandemic. And the reason they became the center of attention is that governments, to the extent they had the resources, buffered the shock of the pandemic by protecting households and businesses from the most extreme forms of damage. And the way they did that is they issued debt and moved those resources over to people who'd lost their jobs, businesses that might have gone, belly up or broke. And that was a good thing to do, right, for the health of the economy. But, as a result, we come out of the pandemic with a demand side of the economy that's much more healthy, pent up demand. So people want to spend money that they couldn't spend before. And that's a world in which the supply constraints are more important, and those supply constraints the mismatch between the supply and demand side is the initial trigger for inflation. So the other thing so there's two things you hear talked about all the time now that you didn't hear much about before. One is supply chains and and how they're put together, and the supply side of the economy and labor shortages and all that kind of thing. And the other one's inflation. If you go back, for the decade before the pandemic, you don't hear much discussion of that. I mean, In the decade after the great financial crisis, we had zero interest rates, negative real interest rates. This is in the developed world, massive infusions of liquidity into the system and no sign of inflation. I mean, inflation was below targets. So, people said, well, there's not much point in talking about inflation. A few people said, well, this is risky and inflation's going to flare up. That turned out to be wrong, so we stopped talking about it. This is a different world in that respect.
Right. Professor Spence, in the mid 1960s, Paul Ehrlich wrote a very controversial book, The Population Bomb, which sort of rekindled all the Malthusian anxieties. But the Green Revolution, Norman Borlaug, and the high yield varieties, as well as rapid connectivity and technology, refuted that thesis, that hypothesis. So, what do you think is the relationship between demography and productivity and efficiency now, especially when everything is digitalized? We have enormous capabilities.
So it's another very good question. I mean, I did a calculation. Maybe I should introduce this way. I did a calculation, and the question that I wanted to answer was, what fraction of the world's GDP output basically is produced by societies that are aging rapidly? And the answer is over 75%. Okay. So the way the world looks now, which is different from the one that, they were writing about in the 1960s, is you have most of the world's output coming from countries. They're not just developed, there's, high middle income and so on. China being is an example, that produce, somewhere between 75 and 80% of the world's GDP. So aging is a constraining factor on the size of the labor force. Many labor forces are actually declining. The population's declining. The fiscal balances are out of whack in many countries because of the way Social Security has been constructed for a time when longevity wasn't the same as it was, and fertility rates weren't as low as they are. So high dependency ratios, high and rising dependency ratios, these are all imbalances that are the result of an unforeseen shift in the way demographics interacts with the economy. That's the world we live in, right? So there's, however, those economies that are aging and produce almost let's call it 75% of global GDP, that's only 33% of the world's population. The other 2/3 of people live in countries that are really quite young and are going to be quite young for a long time. And they seem to me to come in two categories. So there are countries in various parts of the middle income transition that are young. India is the biggest example. And, because the economy is functioning on all cylinders, this youth dividend is actually a dividend and is an accelerator of growth. And as India gets bigger, the calculation I just reported to you will start to change, right? It'll become a more prominent part of the global economy, and the part that's struggling with aging is going to decline. I think so the immediate challenge, I think the best solution for the aging part of the global economy is a productivity surge, which is possible given the technologies we have, especially Gen AI. So where's the residual? Just one final comment. Where's the residual of what they were worrying about in the 1960s? And the answer is it's in a subset of the low-income countries. And the reason it's there is they're not growing, and the fertility rates in some cases are very high, like 5 or 6. When you compare that to, a kind of South Korea where it's under 1, that's under 1 and the population shrinks, over 5, and you have an enormous number of young people coming into the economy at a rate that's hard to produce jobs for. So I think, the part of the population bomb discussion that's still with us is the scenario in which you don't get growth in countries that have very high rates of producing young people, because that's a kind of powder keg that could go off. So I don't think that problem is, entirely gone away, but the world looks, a bit different because of the fact that we've had so much growth in the emerging economy since that was written.
So that's basically the bottom billion, to use a phrase by Paul Collier, that we need to reduce glaring inequities and divide for the bottom billion.
Yeah, no, basically, they need, one way or another, through their own efforts and some external support, we need growth. And we need, low carbon growth in those countries, because and demographics is a slow moving thing. I mean, there are relatively few examples of successful interventions in the demographic dynamics of a society. China, had a one-child policy, probably kept it too long. Other attempts to deal with demographics interfere with what are widely viewed globally as individual and family rights, and they don't tend to go over very well. You can change the incentives. I mean, you can. I mean, if you have a lot of child care and a lot of other things, I think people probably tend to have more children than if they think it's too expensive. But demographics is a whole different world.
Thank you so much, Professor Spence, for your time and for the very insightful responses. And I particularly liked an anecdote that you quoted. It was an interaction of Zhou Enlai, I believe, with Henry Kissinger. He was asked, "What do you think about the French Revolution?" And he said, "I think it's too early." So, are we
too early to tell?
Exactly. We are at a similar stage regarding the potential or the doom of generative AI. So, as you said, the jury is still out.
The jury is definitely out. I've subsequently learned there's some question about whether Zhou Enlai actually said that, but anyway, it's a good story, and the idea is right. There are times in which it is not possible to make a precise forecast, and especially in Zhou Enlai was talking about a period of massive structural change and transition in the Chinese economy, and globally we seem to be in another one of those periods where precise forecasts of where we're going to be in 5 years aren't probably going to turn out to be very accurate.
Thank you so much, Professor Spence, for your time and patience. It was a real pleasure interacting with you.
It was a pleasure and an honor to be here with you too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.